Well, Taya, it's so great to reconnect with you. We first met about 10 years ago at the University of Utah, and we were both pretty sure we met then, but that was at the beginning of my PhD program, and I was, I have a hard time remembering those days. But anyway, I'm grateful that you would take a few minutes to chat with me again today.
Well, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
And Taya, you've had such a productive career, and as you think back on the lessons you've learned, the discoveries you've made, what things would you most want to pass on to others?
I think it's a great question. It's a tough question. I'm thinking about when I first started in the field, and probably the work I'm most known for has to do with guilt and shame. And so I can share a little bit about sort of how my research on morality and ethics got started. So I was a PhD student at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. I was working with my advisor, Chet Insko, and another professor of psychology, Abigail Panter. And there's another doctoral student in the lab, Scott Wolf. And we were um, trying to figure out how to study morality. And this is back in maybe about 2004, 2005, before there was this big explosion of research in psychology and OB. Um, and where we landed was on guilt and shame. Which is funny because the joke we had internally with our research team was, what kind of research project do you get when you have two Jews, a Catholic, and a Baptist minister's son working on a project together? And it was a project on guilt and shame. And anyway, and so we, at the time, what we were interested in was trying to figure out the different norms for when we're interacting with someone one-on-one in an interpersonal situation versus intergroup, the difference between me and you versus us and them, or us versus them. And so kind of the kind of main finding that I think is very important from that line of work, but not the focus of the guilt and shame, but the main finding there is that when people interact personally, one-on-one, we're generally very cooperative, trust one another, but things change in a pretty fundamental way when it goes to intergroup, where there's fear and greed, when it's, us versus them. And for this first project that we were working on, we were trying to understand how the moral norms, our standards of right and wrong, are different in many ways when we move from an interpersonal to an intergroup situation. Um, and so we decided how we would study that is to, with the idea that, well, when we do something wrong, if we don't live up to the norms, or if we behave contrary to that, we might feel bad about ourselves or bad about our behavior, right? We might feel guilty, we might feel ashamed. And through the course of working on that project, we did a deep dive into kind of understanding what guilt and shame are and what some of the differences are. And so, related to that, I think the one thing that has been very sort of important to me and what I'd want others to know is the difference of focusing on your behavior. So I've done something wrong, and you can apologize for that. You can try and do differently in the future, and how that's very different than focusing on yourself. I'm a bad person, or I'm flawed in some way, with the former being guilt about your behavior and the latter being more shame about yourself. And the consequences of those two emotions are pretty dramatically different.
So, really interesting. A few things that made me think of this way we behave when we interact personally. Uh, I was just interviewing Ann Tenbrunsel, and she was talking about how we make predictions about how we might behave on, for example, if we're negotiating against somebody who's super aggressive, we predict that we're just going to match their aggression and we're going to fight right back. But what tends to happen is we want to become very cooperative when we're acting at an individual level. And I just, it's so clear to me that I do that, that on an individual level, I tend to be very cooperative. But as I teach leadership and ethics, it's so amazing every time I put students into group and create any sort of like minimal competition, how quickly it devolves into a us versus them. Not devolves, but how the dynamics change. And so this distinction is always so salient to me when I'm teaching. But then I remember learning about this guilt and shame distinction around 2010. And the very first time I heard it was like, it was one of those moments where it was like, that provides some really good clarity around concepts that maybe I would have, used synonymously, but uh, it just felt like a really good insight that provided a great framework for me moving forward.
Yeah. Yes, I agree on both points. For the first part with the interpersonal versus intergroup, I think that distinction it's very important in that it can have these different lead to different behaviors because when I'm in a group, especially if I have constituents or other group members that I'm representing, then I have, this pull to help people, to help others, which may mean acting competitively towards those outside, the group. So in group, out group dynamics. And I can still feel like a good person. I can, display certain virtues like loyalty. But at the same time, not going to consequences and harm those outside the group, and then you kind of bring in trust of in-group members and distrust of out-group members, and all of these dynamics come into play even in a classroom setting where it's not actual scarce resources or things that would make conflict escalate outside the classroom setting. And so I think all these different factors, the fear, the greed, the social support within the group, um, the accountability to in-group members, all of that kind of can drive behavior. Whereas I would say I'd contrast it to other kind of findings in psychology where maybe there's one key mechanism or sort of one motivation. Whereas when you get differences between intergroup versus interpersonal, there's a lot of different mechanisms, a lot of different processes that can give rise to the more competitiveness of groups, relative more cooperativeness of individuals. Um, and then to the second point on guilt and shame, so I started studying this difference. I was inspired very much by a psychologist named June Tangi, who was one of the people who pioneered that distinction and wrote a book about guilt and shame, focusing on the difference between you know, um, negative self-evaluations or shame. And when I feel like I'm flawed or a bad person, that can be associated with withdrawal or avoidance or anger, or because you feel there's not much you can do to change. And that's different than if you focus more specifically on a particular behavior. And both emotions, guilt and shame, can be painful, but when the focus is on something specific, I think it gives us more opportunities to either try and repair for what we've done, or in some cases that may not be possible, but we can at least enact different behaviors in the future. So it gives us some hope or some direction to move towards. Whereas with shame, if we feel like it's our whole self and something about who we are as a person, who I am, that's I think much harder to deal with. Um, and then of course there's implications. Think of what we want others to learn. I think of parenting with my two young children and giving feedback, and there's ways in which we can frame things more narrowly around a specific behavior versus more global, both on the positive and negative side. So when we give so giving feedback for trying to correct a behavior, whether a child or a student, I think a lot about this in terms of focusing on a specific behavior as opposed to more general statements that might make a person think it's something about who they are as a person.
So, are we more likely to shame ourselves and guilt others? Meaning, like, if my child does something wrong, I feel like I'd be very compassionate towards them, and it's like I'd focus a lot on the behavior. Whereas if I do something wrong, maybe I'm more likely to say, like I have a personal defect and the issue is me.
Yeah, it's an interesting thought. I certainly don't know of any research that kind of has tested that directly, which makes me think it's a interesting research question. I could imagine the opposite prediction as well. If people are very motivated to maintain a positive sense of self, then I think admitting to some flaw or problem or defect, I think actually would be, unlikely for many people because it's, we have to be very vulnerable. Now, some people certainly, I think, may have a tendency towards that rumination or shame proneness or other things that might go along with it, but um, unclear to me that it would be more likely with ourselves than others. With kids or family, I think that's different because it starts to blur the line. If it's our children, it blurs the line between, is it ourselves, is
So,
it
yeah,
others?
yeah.
When you first we're mentioning with other people, I was thinking of how we like to shame people online and, public shaming, social media, where people are very quick to recognize defaults. Look at, here they go again. Look at this person. They're awful. And they should be ashamed of themselves and things like that. So I probably how close the other person is to us, and when it's close friends, family, um, it may blur the line a little bit.
Yeah, as soon as I asked the question and you started responding, my mind immediately went to social media and then like
Mhm.
in-group, out-group behavior. And it's like if somebody's a member of the out-group, it seems like we're way more likely to shame them and, you know, call attention to their just shortcomings as a human rather than their behavior. So
Yeah.
maybe last question is, as you think about this research on guilt and shame, how do you try to apply this in your own life to be a more moral, ethical, effective person?
So, guilt tends to be a much more healthy, positive emotion than shame. I think guilt, thinking we all do make mistakes, do things that later maybe we wish we wouldn't, or have certain regrets. And I think for me, I try and have self-compassion and focus on the behaviors and not letting it sort of spiral into, as you kind of highlighted before, these more negative global evaluations. And so I think about that, of course, for myself and how I think about my own behaviors, and then if I were to, not live up to my own standards, or how, then I'd want to behave in the future, make changes. I think about probably the most important lesson is that the reason why guilt proneness, this aspect of personality, drives ethical behavior, why it's such an important moral character trait, is because it has to do with a sense of responsibility. People who are more prone to guilt feel a greater sense of responsibility for their own behavior, and that leads to more ethical behavior. And so, I think about that with myself, and then of course with those I interact with, and trying to foster that sense of responsibility. Again, the example I kind of go to this top of mind, at least today, is thinking about things with my kids and how do we foster this sense of responsibility for doing the right thing, ethical behavior. How do I foster that in my kids? I think about it in teaching. When I'm thinking about issues like giving voice to values and honesty, and how do we teach our students to be ethical business leaders and deal with conflicts effectively, and um, be the kind of leaders or people they want to be, and they'll feel good about themselves. So I think a lot about this sense of responsibility, and how that goes along um, with being prone to guilt.
Well, this is so fun for me, and you were the first person on the podcast to talk about guilt and shame, and so I'm excited to think about this topic more. And tonight at dinner, my plan is to talk to my kids about this distinction and try to encourage just a little more responsibility. So I just again want to thank you for your time. Really appreciate you sharing these lessons with me, and I look forward to trying to apply these lessons in my own life.
Oh, good. Well, thanks for having me, and yeah, I enjoyed our conversation.